There is a story James Mooney wrote down in the mountains of western North Carolina, and it begins with water, not a river, not a lake, water everywhere, over everything, the whole world drowned, and only a handful of living things riding it out on a raft. An old Cherokee man named Swimmer told it to him in a cabin on the Oconaluftee sometime in the late 1880s. Mooney was a young ethnographer sent by the government to write down whatever was left before it was gone, and he filled his notebooks with sacred formulas, hunting songs, and origin stories. Buried in the middle of all of it is an account of a flood that came down and remade the world. For a long time nobody thought much about it. It was a myth, one of hundreds. But if you have spent any time near the stranger corners of the internet, you already know that a flood story written down by a careful man in the 1880s is exactly the kind of thing people now hold up and say, "Look, they remembered it too." So let us actually look. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Let us go back to what Mooney really wrote, what the Cherokee really told him, and what came down on that particular stretch of the world in the century that followed. Because the water that came down turns out to be real. It just was not the water anyone expected. Start with the man holding the pen. James Mooney was born in Indiana in 1861 to Irish immigrant parents, and he taught himself Cherokee history before he ever met a Cherokee. He talked his way into the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, the same office that had been set up to catalogue the languages and customs of every native nation in the country, and in 1887 he was sent south into the Great Smoky Mountains to live among the people who called themselves the Aniunwia, the principal people. These were the Eastern Band, the Cherokee who had not been marched west. They were living on a patch of ground called the Qualla Boundary, and they still spoke the old language, still knew the old formulas, and a few of them still remembered the world before the soldiers came. Mooney did something most collectors of his era never bothered to do. He learned the language. He sat with the oldest men he could find, and the oldest and best of them was Swimmer, whose Cherokee name was Ayunini. Swimmer was a medicine man who could not read English and did not want to, and he carried inside his head a library that existed nowhere else on earth. Mooney later wrote that when Swimmer died, a whole literature died with him. What Mooney managed to save he published in 2 great volumes, The Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees and The Myths of the Cherokee, and those books are still in print, still cited, still the closest thing we have to a written record of a spoken world. Understand what that means as a document. Mooney did not invent these stories, and he did not smooth them into something a Sunday reader would find comfortable. He wrote down what the old men said, checked one teller against another, and noted where the versions disagreed. Besides Swimmer, he worked with John Axe, who was past 80 and had been a warrior in his youth, and with a blind man named Suyeta, and with a former Confederate scout called Tagwadihi, the Catawba killer. When their accounts lined up, he trusted them, and when they clashed, he said so. This is why his books still carry weight more than a century later. They are not a romantic writing about Indians. They are a careful listener writing down, as close to word for word as he could manage, a body of knowledge that its own keepers knew was dying in their mouths. Swimmer could not write a line of English, and did not care to, and everything he knew that Mooney did not catch went into the ground with him. So when we ask what the Cherokee told Mooney about the water, we are asking about one of the most honest records of an oral world that America ever produced, taken down at the last possible minute. Now the stories themselves, because they are stranger and older than the flood alone. The Cherokee said that in the beginning there was only water, and above it a crowded sky world, where the animals lived with no room to move. They sent down a little water beetle to see what was below, and the beetle darted across the surface and then dived to the bottom and came back up with a dab of soft mud. That mud spread and spread until it became the whole earth, still too wet to stand on, hanging from the sky by 4 cords at the 4 directions. They sent birds down to find dry land, and the birds came back exhausted, until at last the great buzzard flew over the southern country, and by then his wings were so tired that every downstroke gouged a valley and every upstroke raised a ridge. That is why the Cherokee country is all mountains, they said. The buzzard made them when the ground was still soft. If you have ever heard a modern voice online insist that mountains were not slowly pushed up over millions of years, but shaped fast in a single event by something moving across a soft and flooded surface, you have heard an echo of a story a Cherokee elder told a government man before the automobile existed. Then there is the river. The Cherokee did not think of a river as a thing, they thought of it as a person. They called the river the Long Man, Yunwi Gunahita, a giant with his head in the mountains and his feet far down in the lowlands, and they said he was always speaking, murmuring, and that a trained ear could understand what he said. Every important act in Cherokee life happened at the water. They went to water at dawn to pray, plunging into the cold current at the turning of the seasons, at the naming of a child, before a ball game, before war, after a death. The priests read omens in the way the river took a floating leaf or a bead. Water was not scenery, and it was not a resource. It was the oldest living thing they knew, and it ran through everything they believed. Hold on to that, because the whole second half of this story is about what happened when other people decided that the Long Man was worth exactly so many kilowatts. The water in these stories was never empty either. It was crowded with powers. Under the deep pools of the rivers, the Cherokee said, lived the Uktena, a great horned serpent, thick as a tree trunk with a blazing crystal set in its forehead, so terrible to look at that a hunter who merely glimpsed one usually died of it. The one man brave enough to kill an Uktena took the crystal, the Ulunsuti, and it became the most powerful divining stone the nation possessed, a thing that had to be fed and wrapped and kept apart from ordinary people. At the junction of two rivers where the town of Murphy stands today, they said a monstrous leech lived in a deep hole and could pull a person under, and they called the place Tlanusiyi, the leech place. In the deepest water lived the Dakwa, a fish so vast it could swallow a man whole. And most hauntingly, the Cherokee told Mooney about the Nunahi, the immortals, an unseen people who lived under the water and inside the mountains, and who, more than once in the old accounts, came to a doomed town on the night before its destruction and led the willing away, down beneath the river or into the rock, to live forever and safe underground. Read that again and notice what it is. It is a story about a whole town being taken under the water in order to survive the end of its world. The Cherokee had a myth about towns going under, and then, within living memory, they would watch their towns go under for real. And then, yes, the flood. Mooney recorded it plainly. Long ago a man was down by the river when a dog came up to him and began to speak. The dog told him that a great flood was coming, that the water would rise and cover the whole land, and that the man must build a raft and stock it and be ready. The man asked how the dog could know such a thing, and the dog told him to look at the back of his own neck, and there the man saw that the flesh was already worn away to the bare bone, and he understood the dog was giving up his own life as the price of the warning. The man built the raft. The rains came, the rivers rose, the world went under, and every living thing that had laughed at him drowned. When the waters fell, he came back down to a scoured and empty land and started the world over. If that sounds familiar, it should. It sounds like Noah. It sounds like Gilgamesh. It sounds like flood stories on nearly every inhabited continent, and that resemblance is the whole engine of the modern theory. The claim goes like this. If almost every ancient culture on Earth carries a memory of a global flood that ended a former world, then maybe it was not a myth at all. Maybe there really was a reset, a cataclysm of water that wiped out an older and greater civilization and left the survivors to rebuild with half the knowledge. And maybe the Cherokee, tucked away in their mountains, kept a cleaner copy of the memory than most. Under this reading, Mooney was not writing down folklore. He was taking a deposition. It is a seductive idea, and it deserves an honest answer. So here is the honest answer. The flood motif is everywhere, and serious scholars have argued for centuries about why. The plainest explanation is that human beings have always lived beside water, because water is where the food and the transport and the soil are, and people who live beside water get flooded, rivers jump their banks, coasts drown when the ice melts. A big enough local disaster, remembered and retold across 100 generations, swells into a story about the end of everything, because that is what it felt like to the people it happened to. You do not need one global event to explain 1,000 flood stories. You only need 1,000 floods and a species that never forgets a catastrophe. The earth diver, the animal that brings mud up from beneath the primeval water, is one of the most widespread creation motifs in the northern half of the world, found from Siberia across to the Cherokee, and anthropologists trace it as an idea that travelled with people, not as a newscast of a real morning. And the go-to-water religion, the river as a speaking person, is not evidence of a lost engineering culture. It is evidence of people who lived so close to a river for so long that they loved it like kin. None of that makes the stories small. It makes them exactly what they are, which is the accumulated memory and cosmology of a people who had been in those mountains for thousands of years. The revisionist wants the flood to be a chronicle. The record says it is a cosmology. Those are not the same thing, and pretending they are does the Cherokee no honor, because it treats their entire way of understanding the world as nothing but a garbled security camera tape of a disaster that some other, grander civilization supposedly experienced first. But here is where it turns, and here is why this story is worth 30 minutes of your life. The water did come down on the Cherokee, twice. It came down as a documented, dated, deliberate historical fact, and both times it followed the same buried logic that the flood theorists are always circling and never quite naming. Both times, before the water, there was a ledger. The first flood was not made of water at all. It was made of people, and it started with gold. In 1829, a man found gold in the Cherokee country of North Georgia, near a place that would be named Dahlonega, a word taken from the Cherokee for yellow. It set off the first true gold rush in United States history 20 years before California. The strike was rich enough that the federal government built a branch mint at Dahlonega to coin the gold on the spot, and it ran for decades. One of the busiest early mines in the district was worked by interests tied to John C. Calhoun, the sitting vice president of the United States, which tells you exactly how high the interest ran. Thousands of prospectors poured across the Cherokee line with no legal right to be there, and Georgia, instead of removing the trespassers, decided to remove the Cherokee. The state passed laws erasing Cherokee sovereignty, declaring Cherokee law void, forbidding Cherokee people from digging their own gold, or even testifying against a white man in court. It ran a lottery and handed out Cherokee farms, Cherokee houses, and Cherokee goldfields to white Georgians by the drawing of a ticket, while the families who lived on that land were still living on it. The Cherokee did the thing they were always told to do. They fought it in court, peacefully, brilliantly. Their case reached the Supreme Court twice. In Worcester versus Georgia, in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled for them, declaring that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community over which the laws of Georgia had no force, and that the federal government was bound by treaty to protect it. They won. On paper, they won completely. And it did not matter at all, because the president, Andrew Jackson, simply declined to enforce the ruling, and a small, unauthorized faction of Cherokee men signed a removal treaty at New Echota in 1835 that the vast majority of the nation never agreed to. The Senate ratified it by a single vote. On the strength of that one document, the United States Army was sent in 1838 to gather 16,000 Cherokee people at Bayonet Point, hold them in stockades through a sick summer, and march them 1,000 miles west to Oklahoma. Somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 of them died on the way, of cold, of hunger, of disease, of grief. The Cherokee remember it as the place where they cried. We call it the Trail of Tears. The flood of settlers had come down, and the gold under the long man had priced the entire homeland out of Cherokee hands. Not all of them went. A few hundred hid. They melted into the highest and hardest country of the Great Smokies, the coves and the laurel hells where soldiers did not want to follow, and they survived on a mixture of stubbornness, luck, and one strange arrangement. A white trader named William Holland Thomas, who had been raised in part among Cherokee people and adopted as a boy by a chief, used his standing as a legal citizen to buy land in his own name and hold it in trust for the Cherokee who could not legally own it themselves. Over the years, that land became the Qualla boundary, and the people on it became the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, the ones Mooney would come to live among 50 years later. There is a hard story braided into their survival. A man named Sali, according to the version that hardened into legend, was involved in the death of soldiers during the roundup, and the army offered a deal. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. That if Tsali and a few others gave themselves up to be executed, the rest of the hiding fugitives could stay. Tsali surrendered and was shot. Historians argue about the details to this day, but the Eastern Band kept the story because it told them exactly what their freedom had cost. So, when Mooney sat in Swimmer's cabin in the 1880s writing down a flood that drowned the old world, he was sitting with the grandchildren of people who had personally watched their old world drown. The metaphor was not ancient to them. It was one lifetime back. Now the second flood, and this one was made of actual water, engineered on purpose, and it is the reason the title of this story is not a figure of speech. To understand it, you have to follow the long man out of the mountains and into a boardroom. The rivers of the southern Appalachians, the Little Tennessee, the Cheoah, the Nantahala, the Tuckasegee, fall fast and steep out of high country, and falling water is power. In the early 20th century, a company understood that better than anyone, the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa. Aluminum does not occur as metal in the ground. You extract it from ore by pushing enormous amounts of electricity through it, so much electricity that an aluminum smelter is really just a machine for turning kilowatts into metal. Alcoa needed cheap power on a colossal scale, and the steep cold rivers of the Cherokee country were among the cheapest power in the eastern United States, if you dammed them. So Alcoa and its subsidiaries began buying up the Little Tennessee and its tributaries and throwing concrete across them. They built Cheoah, then Santitla, then Calderwood, then Chilhowie. They built a company town in the Tennessee Valley below, and named it, without irony, Alcoa. The Long Man, the river the Cherokee had prayed to at dawn for 1,000 years, was converted into a running total of megawatt hours, and the metal that flowed out of it went into cookware and wire and, soon enough, into airplanes. There is a grim symmetry in that last part. The river that the Cherokee had gone to at first light to purify themselves was now being run through turbines to make the lightweight metal that would build bombers, and the whole logic of it was invisible to almost everyone who benefited. You bought a cheap aluminum pot in Ohio, and somewhere upstream a sacred river ran a fraction quieter for it. This is what extraction looks like once it is finished and industrialized. Nobody stands on the bank twirling a mustache. A company simply notices that falling water is unpriced power, and that unpriced power sitting next to cheap ore is money, and the rest follows on its own, dam by dam, with permits and bond issues and ribbon cuttings, until the Long Man is a chain of flat green reservoirs with boat ramps. Then the government joined in on an even larger scale. The Tennessee Valley Authority, created in 1933, set out to dam nearly every major river in the region for flood control, navigation, and above all, electricity. And when the Second World War came, the demand for aluminum for aircraft turned that program feverish. The very first dam TVA finished, Norris, up on the Clinch, had already set the pattern in the mid-1930s, buying out farm families, relocating the living, and digging up and reburying thousands of graves as a line item in a construction budget. TVA then built Fontana Dam on the Little Tennessee in the early 1940s, at the time the highest dam in the eastern United States, poured around the clock in wartime to feed the aluminum works, and its reservoir swallowed whole communities. The people who lived in those valleys, mostly poor mountain farmers, were bought out and moved, and the graves of their families were left stranded on the far side of a lake with a road that led nowhere, a stub of highway the government promised to finish, and did not for more than 60 years. That is a real place. Locals call it the road to nowhere. The water had begun, literally, to come down and cover the old world, one valley at a time, and the deepest and oldest of those valleys belonged to the Cherokee. Because the Little Tennessee Valley was not just any drowned country. It was the ancient heartland of the Overhill Cherokee, the mother towns, the oldest settled places the nation had. There was Chota, the beloved town, the sacred capital, a town of refuge where no blood could lawfully be shed, the closest thing the Cherokee had to a holy city. There was Tennessee, the town whose name the entire state of Tennessee now carries, most people never knowing they are saying a drowned Cherokee word every time they name the state. There was Tuskegee, remembered as the birthplace of Sequoia. Think about that name for a moment. The one man in recorded history known to have invented a complete writing system on his own, without already being literate in some other language, was born in a Cherokee town on the banks of the Little Tennessee, and within a few years of his finishing his syllabary, the Cherokee were printing their own newspaper in their own script. The birthplace of the only solo invented alphabet in human history now sits under a reservoir that was built, in the end, to sell lakefront lots. There was Toqua, and Sitico, and Tomotley, and Tellico, whole towns with centuries of graves beneath them. These places had already been mostly emptied by removal a century before. But the ground was still there, the mounds were still there, the dead were still there. And in the 1960s and 70s the government came for the ground itself. The last dam in the chain was Tellico, and its story is one of the strangest fights in American environmental history. TVA proposed Tellico Dam not really for power, since it would generate almost none on its own, but to flood the lower Little Tennessee and sell the newly created waterfront land for development. Farmers fought it because it would drown some of the best bottomland soil in the state. The Cherokee fought it because it would drown Chota and Tennessee in the graves of the mother towns. And then, improbably, the whole project was nearly stopped by a fish. Biologists discovered in the river a small, uncatalogued perch called the snail darter, and under the brand new Endangered Species Act, the presence of an endangered species in the path of a federal project was supposed to be a hard stop. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1978, in Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill, the court ruled that the law meant exactly what it said, and that the nearly finished dam could not be closed if it would wipe out the fish. The Cherokee and the farmers had, once again, won in the highest court in the land, and once again it did not matter. Congress, unwilling to lose a dam it had already paid for, passed a special exemption lifting the darter out of the way, and President Carter, against his own stated conscience, signed it. The gates of Tellico closed in November of 1979. The water rose over the bottomland, over the mounds, over Tennessee, over Chota. The beloved town, the sacred capital, the place of refuge, went under a reservoir that people now water ski across. There is a footnote to the fish that the honest version has to include. The snail darter, it turned out, was not quite as alone as everyone had thought. Small populations were later found in a few other nearby rivers. The species hung on, and in 2022 it was taken off the endangered list as recovered. A skeptic will say this proves the whole fight was overblown. The fairer reading is that the darter survived by luck in the handful of rivers nobody had dammed yet, and that its survival says exactly nothing about Chota, which did not get a spare copy of itself somewhere else. The town is still under the lake. The fish got a reprieve the beloved town never did. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because it is the same shape 3 times over. In 1832 the Cherokee won at the Supreme Court and were removed anyway, because gold had already priced the land. In 1978 the Cherokee and their neighbours won at the Supreme Court and were flooded anyway, because the dam had already been budgeted. The law kept siding with them, and the ledger kept overruling the law. The water that came down on the Cherokee, both the flood of miners in the 1830s and the flood of reservoirs in the 20th century, was never about water or gold or fish. It was about who gets to price the ground and the river, and the answer was never the people who had been praying to that river since before the pyramids were raised. There is a strange grace note to how it ended. The outcry over drowning Chota was loud enough that TVA and a crew of archaeologists raced to excavate what they could before the flood, and the remains of Cherokee people disturbed by the reservoir became one of the early flashpoints that helped drive the passage, years later, of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the law that finally gave native nations a legal claim to their own ancestors dug out of the ground. And at Chota itself, the Cherokee were allowed to raise a memorial. The exact centre of the old townhouse, where the sacred fire had burned, stood on a slight rise that the engineers agreed to leave a foot or two above the waterline. So today, if you go out to Tellico Reservoir, there is a small artificial peninsula, and standing on it are 8 stone pillars marking the 7 clans and the sacred centre of the beloved town, holding just above the surface of the lake that covers everything else. Chota is not entirely gone. It is a monument on a made island, ringed by the water that came down, kept dry by a couple feet of fill, and the same law that took a lifetime to arrive. It is worth picturing what that place looks like on an ordinary Saturday. Bass boats idle over the drowned townhouse. Somebody is selling gas and worms at a marina built on the reservoir the dam created. Retirees in lake houses look out over water that is, to them, simply a pleasant view with good fishing, and almost none of them know that a few feet down, in the green dark, lie the capital of a nation and the birthplace of a written language. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody is hiding it. The historical markers are right there on the bank for anyone who stops to read them. It is something stranger than a cover-up. It is a whole country that drowned a holy place, wrote down in precise detail exactly what it was drowning, filed the paperwork, and then went boating on top of it. So go back to Swimmer in his cabin, telling a young man with a notebook about a flood that drowned the world. The revisionists want that story to be a memory of a lost golden civilization erased by a cosmic reset, and they will point at the resemblance to Noah and Gilgamesh and say the resemblance proves it. But the resemblance proves something simpler and sadder. It proves that human beings who lose everything to water build a story around the loss so that their grandchildren will understand what a flood can do. And the Cherokee did not have to reach back to a mythic prehistory to know it, because it was happening to them and to their parents. Their homeland was priced by its gold and taken. Their river was priced by its current and dammed. Their capital was priced by its lakefront and drowned. There is a lost civilization under the water in the Cherokee country. It is not Atlantis, and it is not Tartaria. It is Chota, and Tanasi, and Tuskegee, and the mother towns, and it is not lost at all in the way the theorists mean. It was carefully, thoroughly, legally documented on its way down, town by town, and grave by grave, by the very institutions that flooded it. The receipts exist. That is the part that should unsettle you. Not that the record is missing, but that it is complete. The flood is real. It always was. It just did not come from the sky in some forgotten age. It came from a dam gate in 1979, and from a lottery ticket in 1832. And it came down on a people who had spent 1,000 years learning to hear a river speak, right up until the moment the river was turned into a switch. So, the next time someone shows you an old flood story and tells you it is proof of a vanished world, do not roll your eyes and do not swallow it whole. Do the harder thing. Ask who lived on the ground before the water came. Ask what was under that ground that somebody wanted, and ask who got paid when it finally went under. Then go and find the nearest large reservoir to wherever you are sitting right now, and look up whose town is at the bottom of it, and who owns the power that comes off the top. You will almost never find a lost race. You will nearly always find a ledger, and you will understand, the way Swimmer understood, that the water always comes down for a reason, and the reason is almost never the one written on the surface. Make of that what you will.